Hey guys, it's Zach with Splitwood Studio, and for any of those wondering, I am currently undergoing a name change from ZWR Woodshop to Splitwood Studio. Today I'm working with this really beautiful birch slab that I got from a local slab provider called Utah Tree Cycle, and I'm going to be turning it into an epoxy river table with some Liberty Copper mica pigment that really turned out beautiful. But I love the look of this slab. This slab had a lot of twisting going on, so it actually caught my saw blade at several times just trying to pinch it. So I had to almost use it as a dado blade, go in an inch, pull out, and twist it a little bit to make it a wide enough cut that I could get it without pinching the blade too much. Eventually I got it all cut down to the size I wanted, and then it was on to prepping it to get at least one side flattened. And to do this, you just use a couple shims and some hot glue to make sure that it doesn't rock while you're putting it through the router sled. And I was running out of shims, so I had to make it work with what I had. This router sled is a fairly new tool for me. I had a little DIY version before, just made out of some melamine, but I recently built this and I have been loving it. It is such a fun tool. But I learned the hard way on this project to always make sure you lock in the height. And I actually did lock in the height, but I hadn't adjusted the set screw, so it wasn't holding it quite tight enough. And so if you look really closely, right about where I'm at right now, it dropped down about 3/8 of an inch, which is quite a bit to drop down and take off more than what I wanted. And so it ended up making the overall table thickness about 3/8 to half an inch shy of what I wanted it. I am glad that I learned that on this small table rather than a commissioned piece though, as that would have been even worse. Well, the dust shoe does pretty good at collecting almost all of the dust. There is a little bit left around the edges that I just go around and clean up, but really that's not a big deal, especially compared to my old melamine version where there was no dust collection at all, so it just went everywhere. This version keeps it all confined. Next step is cleaning up the edges. I do that just with some nylon wheels that I got off of Amazon. They're pretty cheap, they last a good while, but most importantly to me they aren't quite as aggressive as a metal wheel that you might be using for some more rough material, where this birch is a fairly soft material that you don't need to be aggressive with. Next step is just prepping the form for the epoxy, and on previous attempts at doing epoxy tables, I've always done mold release spray, and all of those attempts have failed for some reason or another, but I wanted to try out just the packing tape version, as I've heard pretty good things about it, but haven't tried it until now. One thing I have learned on my previous attempts is to always clamp down whatever the wood or material you're working with is to make sure it doesn't float up. And I did that for this larger form, but then completely forgot to do it for my small coasters that I was going to make on the side. And right now I'm mixing in some Liberty Copper mica pigment from Black Diamond Pigments. And this was my wife's choice, and she nailed it. I tried out probably 20 or 30 different pigments and colors to see what would look best, and it looks really good. I love how it turned out. I did mix way too much, however, even with the little coasters that I'm going to do on the side, and so that's something I'm going to have to get better at, is calculating how much epoxy I'm going to need, and also remembering to level the form before I start mixing and pouring the epoxy. This was my first successful epoxy pour where it finally hardened. Previous times it was either too cold and didn't harden, or I didn't get the right ratios. And so I was excited to try out busting it off from the melamine form, and it was actually fairly easy. I used my little toy hammer that my son typically plays with, and it busted right off with no problem. Then I threw it back onto my router sled jig and took off just about 1/8 of an inch to make sure I had one really flat side, and then I could throw it through the planer, as it was about 12.5 inches wide, and this planer will go about 13 inches wide. And the planer just leaves a better finish when it comes to the next step, which is sanding. There isn't as much chip out that you'd either have to sand or fill. and so it was just going to save a little bit of time. Then I got to break out my new toy, which is the Festool ETS EC150. This sander is a dream tool for really any woodworker that's more than a hobbyist. It saves a lot of time and a lot of hand fatigue. I seriously love it. After finishing up sanding, I did a slight chamfer on the top and the corners, then moved on to prepping for the legs. And I wanted to do threaded inserts just because I feel like they look a little bit more professional. However, they were just about as thick as the tabletop, so I had to sand about 1/8 of an inch off just to prevent them from busting through the top. I also had to buy some shorter furniture bolts. After I finished getting all the threaded inserts in, I moved on to mixing the Rubio monocoat. And that's been my favorite finish for the last couple of projects. It's a really amazing product, and it was actually designed to be a finish for wood flooring, so you know that it was designed pretty well and will be very durable. I also really like its sheen. It's more of an eggshell sheen than a semi-gloss, and I just think that that works really well for a lot of different furniture projects. After about 15 minutes of that first coat being on, I wipe it off to make sure that there's no excess, and then I flip it over and immediately do the top as well, leaving the bottom on some cookies that help raise it up so that air can get in there. The biggest reason for doing that is that the wood on the top is open to the air and moisture, and if left that way for even just 24 hours, it could end up warping, as one side can accept moisture while the other side that has the finish couldn't accept moisture. And this way helps to prevent that. And I haven't actually had any issues with any marks from those cookies on the bottom side. And I always try to line them up with where the legs are going to be, just so that if there are marks, then they'll be covered. Before I get to the finished product photos, I just wanted to remind you guys to like and subscribe to the channel. I hope to be able to put out videos similar to this one once a month, maybe even more often than that if things go well. Also, please comment what you think about the table. Do you think it looked good, or is it just another epoxy river table?